Yeah, it's like,
I'm telling you now, it's wonderful to have Sutapa Biswas here. She was a student here, an MA student a while back. Some of her biographical details: she was born in Shantiniketan in West Bengal. She moved to London when she was 4. I met her many years ago, both of us teaching at Chelsea in '89, and I remember her as being a very powerful and a wonderful teacher and very convincing, discusser, and I don't know if that's the right word. Anyway, she came to the Slade, and very soon after the Slade, in 1985, she showed at the ICA, and she's had solo shows all over the UK, and she's represented by Nara Rosler in Sao Paulo, and Gallery Biswas in Delhi, and Elizabeth Leach in the West Coast of America. She's done many, many exhibitions, so I'm not going to go through them all, but not so long ago she was in the Japan Triennale. She had a 2-person show. It was selected, the organizer was Keith Whittle, and it was joined with the Beppu Project. It's a very well-known event. She's in many collections, including the Tate, Sheffield Museum, APT New York, Arts Council, of course, and of course many others. Anyway, welcome, Sutapa.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think I'm connected to this one, so I just need to give you about that. Just to start off by saying thank you so much for inviting me to do the lecture today. This is the first time I've spoken at the Slade since my having been a student here, well over 20 years ago, a very, very long time ago. So it feels quite wonderful to be able to have an opportunity to come back and feel like you're on the other side of things. But also, the Slade School certainly is an institution, as indeed is UCL, a place that's really very close to my heart, because I was a student here. I have both my sisters were doctoral students here. So in many senses, actually I correct myself there, one of my sisters was a doctoral student, the other was a postgraduate student, and then went to Imperial. So I have a kind of long family connection to UCL. Anyway, it's a great honour for me to be here today. Bear with me a little bit, because I've been teaching all week, and so my voice is a bit hoarse. I just really wanted to, I haven't said thank you to them, also to clarify that currently I am not represented by, I have shown with all 3 of those commercial galleries, and I have an open relationship with Nara Rosa Gallery, who are based in Sao Paulo, and Gallery Biswas and Elizabeth Leach Gallery are both commercial spaces that I've worked very positively with, we have a kind of amicable relationship with. But I and Nara Rosa, I still have an open relationship, but I'm not really represented by either Elizabeth Leach or Gallery Biswas anymore, so I should just clarify that. And part of the reason, if I can be honest, is because of the time difference. Because it's really hard work, when you are on this side of, on this side of the meridian line, if you like, to continue that kind of long distance relationship. And it's perhaps something that you might think about actually as students now, going into the professional sphere. How do you, consider your time, etc. So I just wanted to say that, and also then to perhaps move on very quickly to my practice. When I talk about my work, I find that the most useful way of perhaps trying to relate or speak about my working process, my ideas, the contexts, the concepts, etc., is to pitch my practice in a way that, especially in this sort of context, where I hope for students, it becomes part of a learning process in the sense that you can take from it bits that are relevant to you. Because, being, the job of being an artist and working in a professional sphere is really probably one of the toughest things that, one can do. And it takes courage, it takes determination, it takes integrity and ethics and so many different things, and you have to remain very passionate and determined in your outlook. So I hope that maybe what I'm able to do today is to really bring some of the things that for me have been quite critical and have helped me in terms of shaping the way I approach my practice. Obviously, if you have questions at the end, I'm happy to take questions either in relation to my work or more generally in relation to my life as a sort of professional artist. Of course, at the Slade, you have incredible access to a coterie of very brilliant practicing artists and thinkers. And of course, being part of UCL, you're also very privileged to be able to have access to lecturers and professors and thinkers and people, academics who work in other disciplines. And I really do hope that you take advantage of that, because it's such a unique time to be here. Anyway, so moving forward, because I know that time is limited and we are on the birthday. Okay, so spatial stories is really something that I want to maybe think about in relation to my work. Time regained from fugitive, or the fugitive, to the present. In beginning to write my lecture for today, I began to wonder when last I had spoken in this kind of public context about the nature of my artwork. It took me a while before I remembered, and then it dawned on me that the reason for this is that in the making of my work, I believe that I'm in a continuous state of dialogue with myself, with others, and with the wider world somehow. That is my place, both here and over there, both inside and outside. And with this in mind, I feel I can draw upon a quote from Marcel Proust's writing that I've been very, and he's one of the people whose writings I've been very inspired by. And what he says is, and although it's a kind of parallel comparison and analogy, he writes, or wrote some time ago obviously, a book is the product of a different self from the one we manifest in our habits, in society, in our vices. If we mean to try to understand this self, it is in our inmost depths, by endeavouring to reconstruct it there, that the quest can be achieved. So, in other words, for me, if you think about the process, or thinking about the process of making art, it is an endless conversation where one is constantly having to think about the things that you're drawn to in a very kind of automatic way, and how in unpicking those things, how you take bits of those pieces, if you like, those fragments, and how they kind of resonate or are of any kind of relevance to your own sense of being. So like a compass, art sits on the edge or on the horizon, line of horizon. My works are really about spatial stories, about entanglements and threads and disorder and order. I work across medium, and some of the key ideas I explore in my works include concepts of space and time. And I do this in whatever medium I feel is appropriate at the time of making my work and working through an idea. So this could be from painting to working in sculpture to working in film, digital video format, to working in drawing, performance or photography. My work engages with absences as much as presences, things that are there and not there, things that are there but that go unseen. As Andrew mentioned, I was born in India in 1962 and have lived in England from a very young age. Growing up in London, I felt the impact of a country in the UK, i.e. the UK, deeply entrenched in a colonial history and slowly, in different ways, coming to terms with a shifting demographic and the loss of its colonial dominion. And in many senses, that presented for me the kind of landscape or the terrain within which I, as a young child, as a young, student, really kind of came to be experiencing and seeing the world. As somebody who came to Britain at a very kind of critical period in history, where in terms of a sense of Britain's own identity of itself, things were really beginning to, in some senses, fall apart, or certainly to be disentangled and be pulled apart. So I'm going to start with this particular work. It was made in 2015, whilst I was Kashima Artist in Residence in Japan. And this was something that was sponsored by the Every Project and also the Cultural Affairs departments, which is part of the government of Japan. And I, along with Anna Chotsko, were invited to come and make work as artist in residence in support and to be exhibited as part of the, it was called the Mixed Bathing World 2015 Triennale. And this particular work, when really came to me, I don't know if anyone knows the sort of province or the kind of the province, the region of Oita in Japan. And I had never been to Japan before, this amazing opportunity. And having travelled there, I began to realise that Japan is, a relatively new volcanic island, and that geographically and in terms of its sort of geological being, Oita is really quite unstable. So it's this extraordinary place in Japan where there's just steam coming out of the earth, everywhere around you. There's just huge plumes of smoke, which aren't smoke, it's just the steam coming out of the physical earth. And there was something about being in this particular prefecture of Japan that was really quite extraordinary, because it's not part of a major sort of city in the sense that it's not, it's not Tokyo or Kyoto or Osaka, but it's part of what was previously a port city, so it has a very interesting history. But the thing that was really interesting for me as an artist was that as an Indian artist, Indian-born artist, but someone who was living had grown up, on the British system, had grown up in Britain, I was really quite curious. The Japanese people who lived there found me to be a curiosity. They couldn't quite place me. They didn't know. They could see that I had been born in one place and, spoke with a different sort of voice. They were very curious. But in any case, it was also around the time that in the Mediterranean, because of the war in Syria and in the Middle East, people were dying in the Mediterranean. And we know that history because this is something that we've been very much exposed to. And so on one very dark evening, very late at night, maybe space. I just felt that, you know, and thinking about all of the trauma that was going on around the world, that I felt as if I wanted to be swallowed up whole, you know, and just kept there, you know, not to be kind of thrown out in a way of being rejected. And I suppose that for me that's interesting because it begins to open up all kinds of conversations about belonging and trauma and displacement and history. The work I'm showing is not chronologically presented. This is a digital video work called Under My Table, and it's a production still. And I'm going to just describe it. It was made in between 2001 and 2004, and it's a really simple work. And essentially, what happens is that you experience this damask tablecloth just moving in and out of that space, consequence of the air that's blowing around in that room. And it's a fairly regular sort of movement, so it feels a little bit like a bodily function, like a heart or something that's, you know, beating very fast. And I don't know if we can get the lights down a little bit more, please. Thank you. Just because what I'm seeing on my screen actually, maybe we could just have the whole light more or less off. Can we do that? Anyway, I'll keep talking. Just because when you see it projected in, thank you, when you see it projected in a fairly sort of darkened space, it gives off, it emanates quite a beautiful kind of pink hue. And for me, again, there is a relationship between the body and the work I make because of a dialogue with questions around identity, my gender, and also, obviously, you know, questions of history in relation to who I am and where I've come from, what that journey is. I'm going to now talk about a work that was produced as part of an installation and came out of a residency with Take Britain in 2014 and 15, titled Radio City. And it's from a series from a work called, which is really an installation and a sound piece that worked together in the context of the work being shown at Take Britain. And it's called Flights of Passage. And essentially what I did, a lot of my work has involved working with the public, working with completely unknown individuals to me, because I've worked both as a practicing artist but also as a curator. But in this capacity, very much, this was very much an artwork. And what I did was to collect a whole number of saris borrowed from friends and relatives that I suspended in the space at Take Britain in, you know, like rows of washing line that the audience could just move through. And there was, of course, a soundtrack, and the soundtrack was based around, it's a piece that I had initially developed in 1994, though this was made in 2014-15. It was a piece that was originally developed in 1994 as part of the project with Locus Plus, it used cost a long time, and the plug-in gallery, which is now the Institute of Contemporary Art, plug-in Institute of Contemporary Art in Winnipeg, Canada. And a lot of my work where I've collaborated with the public, if you like, has involved using as a kind of structural framework the alphabet, the English alphabet, as a kind of taxonomical way of allowing me to create and develop a narrative. So, for example, in this piece, and also a piece in Winnipeg that I worked with in collaboration with Focus Plus, I used each letter of the alphabet to begin to tell the story of somebody that I had had a conversation with the first time round in Canada, and in this context in Cape Breton, during the period of my residency. And I want to maybe talk about the object of the sari. What you see here, of course, is, saris suspended, and they're little labels that have been attached to most of them. And what I did for this piece was to also organise the display, if you like, the objects in colours. So as you move further back into this space, the colours became much more muted, and we moved from quite colourful, sort of strong, sort of bright, vivid yellows, etc., right through to very simple, plain white. So I felt that I was doing a number of things within the context of that piece, but in particular, so this is a detail from one of the work, from one of the saris shown. But in particular, I've got some images here of various people with whom I had worked, collaborated in order to create the soundtrack or the sound component of this piece, Flights of Passage. And with each of these individuals and others, what I did was to invite people to bring along an object that was precious to them, of not necessarily any kind of monetary value. And in the case of Gina Nembard, who you see here, what she did, for example, was to bring with her a butter knife, which that used to belong to her mother. And she brought it along because she said that she could still, the actual handle is made from bone, and it's so old now that she says that she feels that she says, or she spoke about the fact that it was important to her because she felt as if her mother's fingerprints were left as a trace on the surface of that particular butter knife. And so Gina's story and her mother's story became letters of the alphabet that were then part of the soundtrack that was playing in the space. And this is the last piece of coal that was given to Megan Pickering, who, funnily enough, she used to be one of my students at Chelsea College of Art. But she brought along with her a piece of coal that was given to her by her grandmother, who had been a very strong presence within the sort of mining community in the 80s during the miners' strike. And she hails from Durham, and she describes, as part of her narrative, that this is the very last piece of coal that was given to her by her grandmother, which her grandmother had kept aside during the miners' struggles and all the miners' strikes of the 80s, at a time when coal became a very precious commodity and something that people would sell in order to buy food. So there was so much poverty in the community that people were selling their clothes, they were selling their furniture, and her grandmother refused to sell this one precious object. So this also is part of a kind of storytelling, if you like, in terms of the histories of people who have had to deal with all kinds of historic and economic and social circumstances. And ditto, this is Eva Benchova. She's now, actually she works for Tate now, she's about to go out to the Far East, but she spoke about the scarf that she's wearing that was given to her by her mother, and her mother is no longer alive. So for me, as an artist, I'm always really interested in the way in which stories come together, you know, the kind of threads that exist between one place and another, between one person and another, and try to really weave through those, through my work, those various stories that come together in a way that I hope is about journeys, shared journeys, difficult journeys, and again, they're very much about that, the subject of time and space, absence and presence, loss and remembrance, if you like. And on that subject, I'm coming to, this is a work, an image from a dual screen projection called Remembrance of Things Past. And it's a work that was shot on 35mm format and then transferred onto DVD and projected. And it was a piece that was really inspired by an experience in 2001 that I had, where a friend of mine who passed away and with whom I'd worked at the Art Gallery of Ontario a year before she died, and also 10 years before that at Vancouver Art Gallery. I was at a memorial funeral, and looking out of the 5th floor, I just noticed along Toronto Harbour front that there were a group of children who disembarked from a bus, an ordinary school bus, and they seemed to just kind of be stranded there for a while, and they were involved in conversation, in playing guitar, I didn't really know what, because I was watching them through, from the perspective of being on the 5th floor and quite a distance away. But I was really struck by them, and I was trying to create these mini narratives, these mini stories about them, who they were, what they were doing there, what this all meant. And then no sooner as I felt that I'd come to not know them exactly, but to really try to build some kind of story around them, a big yellow school bus came along and took them away. And it really took me back to a question about time, yet again. And I wanted to come back to Proust, perhaps at this point, and I'll hopefully, if I have time, come back to him again a little bit later again. But one of the things that happened to me some time ago when my father died in 2000, and it was just before my friend in Toronto, William Canada, passed away, was that around the time of his death, I read Proust's work before, but around the time that he was passing away, in fact on the day that he passed away, I found myself in what was then Dylan's bookshop, and now I think is Waterstones, it's not very far from here on Gower Street. And I just kept trying to console myself because my father was dying of cancer, and I kept thinking, gosh, when he does pass away, I was very close to my father, I wonder what it will be that I can read that will allow me to feel some level of consolation, because it will undoubtedly be a rite of passage that will leave such an empty space in my life. And as I was wandering through Dylan's bookshop, I just found myself in one of the sort of, specialist areas, if you like, or one of the particular areas, and I happened to pick up a book by Proust, and I was thumbing my way through it, and there was this wonderful quote suppose it was a critique of Proust's writing. But one of the things that it mentioned was the fact that for Proust, he often used so much as, there was so much metaphor. And one of the things that was a strong metaphor for him was a description of the wood pigeon in the forest, and being able to hear the sound of the call of the wood pigeon, or the coo of the wood pigeon, through the distance of the forest. And for me, it was symbolic of how we demarcate time, that you hear things over there in the distance, but somehow feel them in the present, and that in that moment, you never really lose sight of it. So in terms of this particular work, Remembrance of Things Past, it really connected for me to that space around, the past and the present, and how we recall things, and how those things that we recall are very precious to us, and how we try and make sense of those things. And I will talk about that a little bit later again. And it rings very true to me. It stays with me because, in actual fact, the very last conversation I had with my father on the day that he died, on the night that he died, was in fact, it was about Proust, strangely, and the metaphor of the bird and the wood pigeon. In fact, the thing I remember saying to my dad before he died, he was in a state of unconsciousness at that point, was, Dad, I've been reading about the fact that in Proust's lifetime, he had probably written over 1.5 million words. And to me, I'm trying to remember how many conversations you and I have had. And I have to say that, all of those words will undoubtedly amount to more than 1.5 million. And I said, I can't remember all of them, but I used the analogy to talk about the wood pigeon, saying, well, even though you're leaving my life, it's something that I won't forget, because for me rather, you will always be somebody who marks time for me and marks history and place. And it was a very kind of uncanny thing, because my father had been in a state of unconsciousness, and we thought he couldn't hear. And suddenly it was very extraordinary, because he began to cry. And so we did know that he could hear me as I was speaking. So those kinds of moments in one's life, are things that are rites of passage, really, that strangely they're like small knots in a space that you come back to, and then maybe revisit and begin to unpick and try to understand the threads of how you came to that place. And with Remembrance of Things Past, again, and I hope we might have time to play some of it before I take questions. I know I'm running out of time already. So there is a soundtrack, and there are a series of questions that are put to the kids in this space. I recreated it and worked with the Art Gallery in Ontario in 2005-2006 to work with a group of kids who came from very, very mixed, very diverse backgrounds in and around Toronto. Some whose parents were really quite affluent, others who had very, very difficult upbringings, who had suffered drug abuse, physical abuse, all kinds of things. And somehow this work really brought these very different, very interesting, very beautiful group of young teenagers together to talk about their lives and their stories, really. And so I want to come to the story of the birds. And I did bring with me something to read. And again, it's from Proust. series called Birdsong, Time Flies. Yeah, I'll just read this. But on other days, the rain with which the barometer in the optician's window had threatened us would begin to fall. Its drops, like migrating birds which fly off in a body at a given moment, would come down out of the sky in serried ranks, never drifting apart, never wandering off on their own during their rapid course, but each one keeping its place and drawing its successor in its way, so that the sky was more darkened than during the swallow's exodus. We would take refuge among the trees. And when it seemed that their flight was accomplished, a few last drops, feebler and slower than the rest, would still come down. So, for me, birds as a metaphor is something that seems all of its own accord to keep coming up in many ways. And as I've said, as I mentioned already, the context for this work is something that came out of my conversation with my father, because birds were also the first sound I heard after his death. And after his death, what I did was actually to paint a bird a day, just to mark time. And sometimes it was a painting, sometimes it was a drawing, sometimes a very fast sketch. But it became something really obsessive for me, something that I just felt unable to stop myself from doing. And these are sometimes birds that are drawn from real birds, things that this is a bird of paradise that are kind of also imaginary birds. And out of the paintings that I made, time flies, between 2000 when my father died, right through actually till about 2012, out of the paint that was left over from painting the birds, I began to make a series of more abstracted works that were just the leftover material. And this is a piece called What Is Not Said. Again, this is from the same series. In a way, I've kind of gone backwards. This is a work called Birdsong that was made in 2004. And I produced this work around the time that my dad was dying. I became a mum, I should say, in 1997, rather unexpectedly. And around the time that my father was dying, my son was coming into this world. So he was learning speech. And at about 18 months, he, up until that time, he'd been saying isolated words like cheese, star, rice, water. But suddenly, out of the blue, as we were making soup together, he came out with his first, joined up sentence, which was, "I'd like a horse to live with us." And it was really kind of surprising, because we lived at that time in a big old Victorian house on the first floor, steep set of stairs, and I just kept thinking, wow, how can I get the horse up here? And so I said, well, where do you think the horse is going to live? And he said, well, right here in my living room. And for me, this was really quite beautiful, because it spoke about that space between, for children, what is real and unreal. And for children, there is nothing between that space. Everything is real. In their imagination, everything is viable. Everything is possible. And this is something for me that I was very interested in terms of how we unlearn things and how we learn how to not have the extent of that imagination, how we learn to be curtailed and how we learn to be controlled. And so for several years following, alongside making my bird paintings, I worked with Film and Video Umbrella and INNOVA, the Institute of the International Institute of Visual Arts, who are based in London but work in the UK and abroad, in creating this film work. It was shot on 16mm format and is in actual fact a dual screen projection. And I'm sorry, I might not have time to show you the moving things, but I'll just kind of try and talk about it as quickly as I can. So we worked very carefully to it took us a long time to make the work, and I had to work with a wrangler who basically she also trains the horses in the Lloyd's Bank adverts to gallop, to jump. And she took on the project because she said she was very interested in the idea that in this scenario, that she was having to train the horses to stand still, which was the request. And so this interior space was entirely fabricated, and it was inspired in part by what my son said, but when he said it, it took me right back to a painting that I'd seen as an undergraduate student at the University of Leeds that was by Stubbs, called Lord Albemarle and Shooting at Goodwood. And it reminded me of something that the psychoanalyst Frantz Fanon had talked about in his book Black Skins, White Mask, where he asks a very simple question, which is that he says, what does the black man want? And what does the white man want? And set against, if you like, the context of what my son was saying to me, which is, I want a horse to live with us in our living room, it really made me think about that question again. And one of the things, I'm sorry I don't have a detail of the black male servant's face, but one of the things that is really quite extraordinary about this painting, which was made in, I think it's 1758, if memory serves me well, is that I think that Stubbs saw something in the expression of that young black man's face, male servant's face, which is that he was looking beyond the landscape, beyond his position in life, which was as a slave, as a servant to his masters. And so my work that I was making, Birdsong, was very much to do with questions of desire and ambition. What is it that we do want? What questioning systems, power systems and orders, if you like. And so some nuts and bolts. This is how the work was made. It was made in High Wycombe in this 1940s building that doesn't really exist anymore. It's a block of flats, and it was the messiest, dirtiest student house I've seen for a long time. But that was all part of the course. But we addressed it entirely, and I'm quite methodical in how some of my work, how I approach some of my work. So I spent a great deal of time researching the colour scheme that I recreated, so there's a kind of resonance with Stubbs' own work. And in actual fact, I found those objects that you see here, photographed in the English Heritage swatch colours, and we put them inside the room. I'll just go back inside this room. So you'll notice, for example, on this table, various objects that were very carefully stitched together in terms of how I was trying to orchestrate the space. And so this film piece begins with two origami horses that are suspended on the string. You just see them there. And basically they revolve. of chase each other, almost like a fox or an animal chasing its tail. And in the process of that movement, there's a very short number of frames between the left and the right hand screen. So the left and the right hand screen kind of follow each other, but you don't really know which is following which. And there's a real kind of time delay, which for me is very important aesthetically, because it sort of gives you a moment of double take. It's in that tiny frame difference that you're not quite sure if what you've seen is really what you've seen. And it is, for me, very critical to allow that sense of time to be stretched. So this is actually my son in the space. I'm afraid I don't have very much time left, so I'm going to try and maze through, and I can't talk about some of the nuances within the set or how it worked. But one of the things that I was very keen to try to do, for example, was to ensure that this work was made before my son turned 5. And interestingly, when I was in Toronto for this memorial funeral of my friend, I was speaking to Mary Kelly at the time, who was also a good friend of a mutual friend, and I was describing this work and what I was trying to do, and Mary was interesting in the sense that, of course, her work is very involved and she's very knowledgeable as an artist and a wonderful artist. She's very engaged with psychoanalytic theory, and the relationship between mother and child is very evident within her postpartum piece. But for me, it was interesting because Mary actually said to me, that's very interesting that you feel that you need to make this work before he turns 5, because 5 is actually, within psychoanalytic theory, is assumed to be the point at which children are much more in the world, and also it's that moment where they understand how to lie. So this was really interesting, that moment between innocence and something else. And again, formally, in terms of how I construct my work, I try to, there's often references to art historical pieces. This is Petrus Christus's young portrait of a young girl. I don't have much time, actually, so I'm going to just maybe talk very quickly about this piece. As part of Bird Song, that series, I also made another film work called Magnesium Bird, and this was shot in the grounds of the Victorian walled gardens of Harwood House in Yorkshire. And Lord and Lady Harwood were really generous and very sweet to allow us to do that. But alongside making my drawings of the birds, which I talked about, I also sculpted, myself and also with others, a series of quite large birds made out of magnesium ribbon. And what we did through the course of this particular piece is to situate them in that garden and then to film them as they exploded, if you like. And it's a work which is 9 minutes something, 28 seconds long, but the visual is 28 seconds, so it's the soundtrack that carries you. And it was, again, quite an extraordinary experience in making this piece, because when we did the reconnoitre, it was a very calm, very beautiful, sunny day. And of course, we came to filming it, and there were like 4 gale winds, and it was just torrential downpours. I mean, unbelievable. But I often work with friends and family that I know, and most of my family, pretty much all of my family, were travelling up north to Yorkshire from the south, and I was just petrified. Obviously, I got there first and thinking, no one's going to show. But somehow, and what you'll notice from the soundtrack, the fact that they all turned up, and somehow the fact that it was such a torrential kind of stormy day makes this piece incredibly atmospheric, because what you can hear is this extraordinary sound of the wind, hitting the microphone, you know, that sort of, so it was a very evocative work. And what you hear in the background, the reason that I brought my family up was because my nieces and nephews, you can't see them or playing in the far background. And so it's the sound of their screaming and their conversations that carry you through this work. And the reason that I brought that sound into it was because one of the things that for me as an artist I've always been really drawn to is, and for me it's the most beautiful time of day, and perhaps it has something to do with growing up in Britain, when it's 10:30 is usually, it's a really quiet time of day. There's a beautiful lull. And just about at that time, if you live near a school, you can hear the kids come out, and that extraordinary voice, you know, that extraordinary sound of play taking place. So this is the soundtrack to this piece, you know, the kids just sort of running wild and playing. So, I don't think I've got time to talk about much else, but maybe I'll say this. This is obviously a work by Vermeer, and it's really one of the first paintings that I remember experiencing as a child, aged about 5. And the reason it always really strikes a chord with me, even now, is that I must have seen it as a child in, you know, reproduced in Reader's Digest magazine or something, perhaps in the library or whatever. And I remember it's the blue in the painting that really, you know, is haunting for me. And in part it was because as I was growing up, when we first came to this country, one of the things that I most remembered was watching my mother stand in front of a window and reading letters from home from India. And she didn't bring very many things with her when she came from India, because my father left India really overnight because of very difficult circumstances. He was a pacifist, but he was very vocal about various laws that the Indian government, even though it was post-independent India, were introducing. For example, they were changing systems of farming that they called it a green revolution, but he objected because he said that if the government introduced heavy chemical farming, that decades later it would kill the soil. And he was right, actually, because there are huge swathes of land in, for example, Rajasthan now, that you can't farm anymore because it's been so poisoned by heavy chemical farming. Anyway, it was very unsafe for him to stay in India, so he left overnight, you know, in 1965. And 6 months later, we travelled in the dark of night, my mum and 5 kids, from Calcutta to Bombay. We didn't live in Calcutta, we lived outside of Calcutta. And took a ship, one of the last passenger ships that went through the Suez Canal and arrived in England. And so my mum had to travel very lightly. And one of the things that she took with her was a blue sari, blue silk, quite translucent sari of this colour. And I remember her reading the letters on occasion, wearing this extraordinary, you know, article of clothing. And so textiles became very important and symbolic. And it wasn't until much later, when I started to study art history, that I began to realise the symbolism behind this painting. Because if you look at that map, it was also, the painting was made around the time that there was a great expansion of the Dutch Empire, if you like. And of course, we know about the Dutch occupation, the Dutch East India Company. And so there was just something about this painting that had this kind of resonance for me as an artist, but also in, you know, from childhood, but as an artist coming back to it and trying to understand its symbolism, its meaning, and how I can use it. This is a work called Untitled, Women in Blue Weeping. And again, it was inspired by this memory. And you can see that basically I installed it in the Beagles box, which is here at UCL, overlooking the thing. Now, I don't really have time to talk about much more. So I'm going to maybe just flick through these images. This is a work called Matinee, which again was made during my time in Japan. And I think perhaps, and this is 2015, so I'm going to maybe end it there. And I know we don't have time very much for questions or perhaps even to see some of the film works, but I hope, and this is a selection, but I hope at least that gives you a flavour of some of the things that I've been exploring through my practice.
We do have time for questions.
Okay, great. That's the back of the lines on it. And if you're interested, I can show you a little snippet of. Actually, Jack, can we do that? We can turn the lights on anyway, and then I can just show it as we. That's all right. So, are there any questions?
Hi. Thanks for the talk. I was wondering if you could talk a bit more about how you came to work so internationally. I'm just really interested in how you ended up in Ontario, worked with galleries you say in Brazil, and then took the residency in Japan.
It's a really good question, and some of it is just luck. and just, you know, being in the right place at the right time. But certainly in terms of, I'll talk about Japan first. In 2008, I was involved, I was teaching at Chelsea College of Art and Design, and I was involved with an organisation called TRAIN. It's a research centre at Chelsea College of Art and Design. In fact, I helped set, I was the founding member of one of the only artist founding member of TRAIN. Organisation. And anyhow, there was a publication that was, it's a beautiful publication actually, and you remember the little drawing with the heritage swatch colour that I showed earlier on? That was on the front cover, and there was an interview between myself and one of my colleagues at Chelsea called Books, Boats, what was it called? Birds, Books and Boats. And Gallery Nararosla saw the book, and because my cover was on the front, because there was a dialogue between myself and a colleague who wrote, worked with me writing that essay, they came across this work, and they were in particular very drawn to birdsong. And so they have an annual event called the Rosla Hotel, and I think I was Rosla Hotel number 11. I might be wrong there, but I think I was Rosla Hotel number 11. And it's an extraordinary, they're just a beautiful gallery actually. They're just one of the warmest people I've ever had the privilege of knowing. I just love Nara. She's just wonderful. But they invited me as to have a solo show there. And when I arrived there, we were very moved by the work. And Guy Brett, who's actually one of the foremost specialists in Latin American art, certainly Brazilian art, he tells me that I was probably, after that show, he said I was probably the first British artist to ever be commercially represented by a Brazilian commercial gallery. So it was kind of unusual, really. I think Isaac Gillian also shows with them now. And they've worked with Hamish Fulton and various other artists. they do some really interesting work, and of course they represent the estate of Elio Oiticica. So they're a very interesting gallery. So that's how that came about. After I graduated in 1985, I was still a student actually, and I was writing my dissertation. At that time, a dissertation at the University of Leeds had to be somewhere between 15,000 words and 20,000 words. So it was a proper kind of dissertation. And it was hard work, but it was fantastic because that was just the course I was taught by people like Griselda Pollock, and it was a time when T.J. Clarke had set up his, this amazing department of fine art and art history, basically. And I decided to write my thesis, my dissertation rather, on black women artists, because I realised even as a student that there was no literature, very little literature about contemporary black women artists. And I just kept thinking, well, they must exist, And it was very strange because even though I was on this course that was a Marxist feminist course that was looking at post-structuralism and very, very analytical, there was very little dialogue around race and gender and class. And I was very fortunate in that my wonderful tutors, people like Griselda Pollock, Fred Orton, Terry Atkinson, they were very supportive of me, even though I was quite obstreperous sometimes. I was a good student, but they encouraged me to do this research. I met Labena Himid, who's got a show currently at Modern Art Oxford. I think it ends on Sunday, so if you haven't seen it, go and see it. And Labena and I became friends. Well, I was writing about her work. We had this introduction, and I invited her to come to Leeds to do a talk with Sonia Boyce. And I met Rashid Areen, I met Tam Joseph, all of these amazing people, Ingrid Pollard. And I didn't know at the time that Labena was in the process of curating an exhibition called The Thin Black Line at the ICA. And I didn't get to show it, but I can't now because we're still playing this. Oh well. Can I change it? Yeah, is that possible? Sorry. And then, thank you. And so, Labena, I'm going to have to just keep pressing. She saw this work, Housewives with Statements, which you might be familiar with, and let's see if I've got a paint. It's a huge piece of work. And she asked me if I would show it in that space. And when I exhibited the work there, I was only 21 really, it was kind of quite a shock to my system, but I got picked up by the Guardian newspaper, by various magazines, Spare Rib, Art Rage, Artist Newsletter. So Ivona Glaswick, who's now the director of the Whitechapel Art Gallery, invited me to be part of a two-person exhibition with Suko, but actually I wasn't keen to show with Suko at the time, perhaps foolishly. I showed with Margaret Harrison, who's very well known also, and Glynis Johnson. So so my work just got picked up, and I had this extraordinary opportunity to then also show with Emma Dexter, who was a senior curator at Stoke City Museum and Art Gallery. And so really and then around the same time, because I had been taught by Terry Atkinson, who was again very well established, he was very involved with art and language, he knew Judith. He got to know Judith Mastai, who was very senior at Vancouver Art Gallery. And she was introduced to my work through my tutor, strangely. So the moral of the story is keep your tutors sweet. But so she introduced me to, so she was introduced to me through Terry. So she invited me to do a residency. I worked with a group of women artists because I didn't want to parachute down. And I said, well, what can I do? You know, I don't want to just do something that means nothing. And I said, I'd like to meet, work with women. And they were women from the age of 21. Alfreda was 78. Some of the women were trained artists, trained filmmakers. Some had never made art before. And across race, across generations, obviously, and class backgrounds. Some indigenous artists, Japanese, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, I curated, and we collectively created an exhibition, very, very important, in fact. It's in 1990 called Memory and Desire, where we collectively made the work, and the women I worked with also produced work, some new, some old, and this exhibition was shown in Vancouver Art Gallery. I mean, it's quite a story actually, because when I arrived, there were protests, not because of me, but because of Vancouver Art Gallery. And people were just really angry because they were saying that Vancouver Art Gallery never showed artists of colour. And actually then, the director of Vancouver Art Gallery then called me in, and he was very sweet, and he said, I'm so apologetic that you've just arrived and you're having to deal with all of this kind of stuff that's going on. We're very happy for you, we're very happy to pay you, and you know, you don't have to do this, you can go home and we'll make sure that you're paid, and we'll even buy you a first class ticket back. I just thought, this guy really wants to get rid of me. And so I just said, I don't want to go home. I want to work with these people. I'm going to work through this. And actually, it then materialised that the creative men in Vancouver, men of colour, were just, I hate to say this, but they were kind of jealous of the fact that I was carving out a niche for women's voices within the community. They backed off eventually. But one of the things that, and it was okay because I also worked with a guy, when, you know, some of those guys later, you know, 2 years later, it was fine. But we were so determined, and what we did was, in a way, we used it as a bit of a bargaining chip. You know, I actually said to the women, well, what do you want? You know, and they said, we want to be shown not in the educational space, we want an exhibition in the real space. And I said, what else do you want? And they said, yeah. I said, you know, they said to me, we'd like for someone like you, as you've had this opportunity, we'd like the opportunity. So we want this to tour. It's a bit cold, so forgive me if I just put my jacket on. So we'd like this opportunity. So I said, okay, fine. So we made a blueprint. You know, it was an amazing, amazing exhibition, actually. It was the first time something of this nature had happened. So we hired out the exhibition that we curated collectively to Vancouver Art Gallery. We put it in their main spaces, and each participating artist received a fee. And pardon me, but I was already getting paid, so it was okay. And every time it toured, we hired it out, and the women who were involved in that received remuneration for their contribution to the exhibition. And somebody from that group was also paid to go be an artist in residence somewhere else. So it was beautiful, you know, it was really beautiful, because, I mean, it was, you know, it was working with high art, low art, you know, bringing these things together, blurring the boundaries. And sometimes it went to shopping centres, where it was exhibited far and wide across Canada. And other times it went to really beautiful, you know, beautifully designed gallery spaces. And in the mix, what happened was that it became an educational tool for the women to then teach other women that they knew, because then they could extend that project to, you know. So it was a very important, for me, and it was a very important learning curve also for those women, you know, to take ownership of what they did. And it was successful because Judith, who I worked with at the Vancouver Art Gallery, poor Judith, she had a really tough time, you know, she was really on her side. but she, a white Jewish woman, wonderfully intelligent woman, who was kind of seen, she was at the rough receiving end of many people who were angry, legitimately so, with the mainstream dominant art world, certainly within the Vancouver context. But and she invited me 10 years later, in 2000, so 1990 to 2000, to come back and work with her again at the Toronto, at the Art Gallery of Ontario in Toronto. And that's a major, major museum. It's the second largest museum in Canada, and it has a phenomenal collection of antiquities, artifacts, etc. And I was the first artist to be invited to, again, she said, what do you want to do? And I said, well, I want to curate a show. But I would like to work with your historic collection, if that's possible. And it was the first time we negotiated with the curators working in the historic sort of galleries within the historic collections galleries in Toronto, in the AGO. And it was the first, I met with maybe 35 young artists in Toronto. So I interviewed them, I interviewed them, that's a terrible thing to say. We did studio visits, and we had conversations, I corresponded with them, and out of their proposals, they put in proposals. I showed them around the museum. Some of them had never been in the Art Gallery of Ontario, they live in Toronto. But it was amazing. So they had access to this archive that they'd never seen. So it was an open proposal. They submitted potential, projects for the historic galleries. And we curated, I worked in the end with 5 amazing young artists. And it was one of the most beautiful shows, I think, that happened in that space. Sometimes, I wish I had images. You'll have to invite me back, because I can show you the images from that. I know I've got to probably sum up there tonight. So these things have sort of, have just sort of come out of different projects. Often working with very little money, basically, and that's the thing I keep coming back to over and over again, especially at this particular point in time where students are so up to here with debt. It's in your head. I mean, we had a budget for making new work at the Vancouver Art Gallery, $200 each. That was it. Of course, we had technical assistance, and support from the museum. But that was our budget. And in a way, working with a limited budget makes your imagination, expands your imagination. You can do so much. So, hang on to that. You don't need a huge amount of money to be successful. Okay? To make beautiful art is what I'm saying.
Thank you very much.